Okay, thanks very much. One of the reasons that the Shan rebellion is important is that I think in Thailand there is a real lack of rebel heroes in history. I think in a sense the royalist narrative of state formation has largely erased the role of rebels in processes of state formation, not just contesting the state but also actively engaged in their own projects of state formation. This is one rebel. This is the leader of the Shan rebellion who got shot, unfortunately, about 3 weeks into it, a chap called Pakamong. And what I'm going to do today, quite quickly, is just talk a little bit about what the Shan rebellion was and what happened, and then focus on the main issue in hand as to why I think it's important. So, Shan rebels. A group of miners, migrants into northern Siam, timber workers, traders and growers of excellent moustaches, as you can see. So this is a group of Shan rebels. There was a group of them who were miners and traders and part-time bandits who had a bit of a run-in with some of the Siamese police. And as a result of that run-in, they decided to march on the northern Thai town of Prayer. And you can see where Prayer is there. And they marched from about 40 miles north, about 200 of them, into Prayer, killed about 20 Siamese officials, including the Siamese commissioner who'd been posted to the town, looted the treasury, basically took over Prayer. And then they got a bit of a rush of blood and they thought, well, let's turn this into an even bigger rebellion in northern Siam. And they set out and they marched on Lampang. And this was about the high point of the rebellion, because when they reached Lampang, they came across a fairly well-organised local defence force that was also reinforced by some Siamese police. And there was a bit of a shooting match. Poor old Pakamong was killed, and the rebels very quickly retreated back to Prayer. And about this time, this was all in August 1902, they also heard that the Siamese army had mobilised, and there were a number of forces marching north and marching forth to retake the town of Prayer. And here's a picture of those formidable Siamese military men who are marching forth to take on the Shan rebels. And just as a footnote, at this stage when I was preparing this, it occurred to me, like, did these men have any idea that they'd one day be running the country and offering happiness to the entire country, not just to northern Thailand? Now my initial answer was no, they would have had no idea. But after some forensic digital analysis, I thought that perhaps one of them did. One of them did have an inkling. So, we've got some very clever people here at ANU who can... So the Shan weren't silly. They weren't going to wait for this sort of bundle of happiness arriving, and they quickly headed north. They fled north, and they had some confrontations with the army, Siamese troops, around Cheng Kam, and then they headed north right up to the Mekong, where they took refuge in what was then called the reserved zone, or the demilitarised zone. And this was 25 kilometres of Siamese territory along the Mekong that, under the Franco-Siamese Treaty of 1893, the Siamese weren't allowed to have any military forces. So it was a sort of demilitarised buffer zone between Siam and French territory. And rebels love buffer zones because they're great places of refuge where, quite literally, the Siamese forces couldn't chase them. And these rebels basically took over the two Mekong riverside towns of Cheng Kong and Cheng Sen, and over a couple of years basically ruled those two towns under the legal and in some cases practical protection of the French, and launched a number of attacks on this town here, Ban Meki, which was the Siamese outpost in the very far north of Siam. The Siamese, as you could see, set up their outpost right at the edge of that 25-kilometre zone. and these Shan rebels marched on that town and attacked it a couple of times, but never actually succeeded in crushing it. And just one other image here is the French commercial agency. The French set up commercial agencies in both Cheng Kong and Cheng Sen in Siamese territory, but they were had pretences of being French colonial outposts in Siamese territory. And this gave the Shan rebels a degree of protection. The French were also quite keen on cultivating them and perhaps seeing if there could be any military or diplomatic or colonial advantage in the trouble the Shan were making in northern Siam. Now eventually the Siamese got sick of this, and with the agreement of the French Foreign Office in Paris and the Governor-General of Indochina in Hanoi, they massed quite significant military forces and marched on Cheng Sen and Cheng Kong and basically drove the Shan out. A lot of the Shan rebels retreated into the Shan states from whence they had come originally, and a lot retreated over into French Indochina, where some of them settled. Now, they didn't capture a lot of them, but they captured some of them, and here are some of the poor chaps who got captured. Let that be a warning to you all. You start out like that, you don't want happiness, you end up like that. So that essentially is the story of the Shan Rebellion and where it ended. But what I've promised to do for you today is to talk about why the Shan Rebellion of 1902 is important. Now, if you read Thai history, it's written about. It's certainly written about quite a bit in conventional Thai history. And the typical story is that the Shan Rebellion is important because it acted as something of a trigger. It certainly hastened the integration of that northern part of Siam into the modern Siamese nation state. So it certainly prompted the Siamese court to invest money in railway construction rather than irrigation works, which has had very long-term implications for the economic development of Siam. And it also certainly hastened the formal administrative incorporation of the various towns and districts and provinces of northern Siam. So I don't contest that, it's certainly true. But what I'm trying to do with this research, and I'm still at a very early stage of this research, despite Nick pointing out that I did present on a similar topic 2 years ago, still plugging away. What I'm trying to do is situate the Shan Rebellion in a much broader, spatially broader and also historically broader history of Shan disorder in the borderlands of Siam and Burma and Indochina. And as I'll say later, I think this Shan disorder has really played a central role, an important role in shaping the nature of the particular geobody we now see in northern Thailand. So let's look at that Shan disorder. I've always wanted to use the term Shan shenanigans, and I now have. So perhaps for some of you I should translate. What shenanigans, I looked it up in the online dictionary, means high-spirited and mischievous activity. And these Shan certainly were high-spirited. So let's give a bit of a history, and always with histories, where do you start and where do you stop? I'm going to pick 50 or so years leading up to the Shan Rebellion, but for those of you who follow the Shan and Shan state, you could probably carry on right up until today, and you could also go quite a bit earlier. So in the 1860s, the Siamese started worrying because all these Shans started turning up and establishing villages around Cheng Sen, which had been abandoned for most of the century after the Burmese were driven out of Cheng Sen very early in the century. The Siamese and the chiefs in Chiang Mai and Nan and other northern Thai chiefs didn't like this Shan encroachment, so they went and chased them away. Here's a little side story that might seem disconnected. In 1866, there was a palace rebellion in Mandalay, a failed rebellion when this guy, Prince Mingun, one of the King Mindon's many sons, cut off the head of the crown prince, a rather bold move in any country. So that palace rebellion failed, but Mingon ended up fleeing and through a very long and complex history ended up in French Indochina. Where he made a lot of trouble, which I'll refer to a little bit later on. So the 1870s, one of the southeastern Shan states, Mukmai, launched a series of attacks against Chengdao Fang. Round that time, not exactly sure of the particular years, similar Shan attacks on Mehongsong, which became an important Shan settlement in itself. 1882, a big rebellion of some of the eastern Shan states, in particular Chengtung, against the Burmese court in Mandalay, and this rebellion carried on even after the British took over in Upper Burma. Then something of a counter-rebellion led by this chap called Tuet La Ngu, who was very famous for his tattoos and various metallic objects embedded under his skin. And he led a series of rampages in the eastern Shan states, fighting against the rebel states. 1889, Shan involvement in the Chiang Mai rebellion, and some significant backing from Chengtung at different stages of the rebellion that took place in Chiang Mai. 1880s to 1890s, a series of Shan settlements expanding southwards down the Mekong on both what became Siamese and French Indo-Chinese sides of the Mekong. 1893, after the treaty, Shan labourers built Fort Kano, the little fort that the French established on the Mekong up opposite Cheng Kong. 1896, rebel chiefs in Cheng Sen link up with Shan timber entrepreneurs. The biggest business operators in the region were these Shan timber entrepreneurs, and they were involved in all sorts of local politics. Prince Mingun, our friend from the rebellion in Mandalay, was arrested in northern Laos, crossing to Chengtung, where he was hoping to incite a rebellion against the British and reinstall who on the throne of Burma but him. Then another guy, Jiao Fa, I put that in brackets because he was a pretender, they perhaps all are. Katinya launched an attack on the Siamese centre of Merki and was promptly detained by the French and shot. The French, in an extraordinary little subplot, provided arms to some of Mingun's timber worker proteges in Chengsan, and these workers later joined up with the rebels from the Shan Rebellion. So, look, there's as many historical stories there as there are dot points. I can't go into it all now, but I'm just trying to paint a picture. Just let me add a little bit of flesh to that picture. 3 quotes. In the year following the fall of Tibor, Shan state was like hell. In Shan areas, places were at war with each other. There was burning, destruction and looting. Big towns and villages went up in smoke with nothing but ashes left. Villagers fled to take refuge where they could be free. People could not farm, so there was a famine. Where was one of the main places where these people took refuge? In northern Siam. Tuet Nga Lu, the chap who I talked about a minute ago, had been forced to take refuge beyond the Salween. There in Siamese territory, he collected a band of dacoits and idlers and made a descent on Mongpan. It seems to have been little more than dacoity on a large scale, a cattle lifting and plundering raid, but the state had been so depopulated and so reduced in strength that the Salbar, the chief, was compelled to fly. And another, my friend Jalfar Katinya, marched on the Siamese town of Merki, preceded by the French flag, golden parasols and the whole regal paraphernalia. He roamed the reserve zone, marching towards Merki, killing a few people, pillaging and burning, but once he met the people of Merki, he had to retreat after a series of serious fights. Some of his men were killed, some of the other side was killed. So, just a bit of a flavour for what was going on in this region in the decades leading up to the Shan Rebellion. So let's give this a bit of spatial sense. There's a nice Landsat image of the region I'm talking about. Let's just orient ourselves. There were the 2 main, I suppose, royal Siamese governments outposts, Chiang Mai and Chiang Rai. And surrounding that, and here I'm going to be slightly overly colourful just to make the point, surrounding that is a sort of whole arc of Shan disorder in the decades leading up to the early 1900s. So each one of those blobs represents one or two of those incidents that I talked about a few slides ago. So it's tempting to say you've got a few outposts of yellow surrounded by a disorderly sea of red, but the colours are entirely arbitrary. So my argument here, and once again I'm at the earliest stages in developing this, is that if we look at this spatially and historically, we can start to get some insight into which this network of Shan disorder really helped to shape the emerging geobody in northern Siam. So you can trace some of the ways in which some of the responses to this disorder and these rebellions shaped particular border negotiations. You can also trace the way in which these rebellions and this disorder shaped some of the ways in which territory was imagined. And certainly the idea of having to have secure control, exclusive sovereignty of a particular piece of territory becomes a very important discussion in the management of these rebellions. You can see very influential early ideas about threats of foreign intrusion. The Shan were a classic threat of foreign intrusion disrupting this nascent geobody of Siam. You can see early ideas of the idea of internal threats. The Shan were particularly threatening because not only were they inside, but they were settled all through these communities in northern Thailand. So you had this, as Tongchai has described it, this other within. I'd like to talk about these in more detail, but I'm running out of time. One last point, you also start to get ideas emerging about the role of the monarch in protecting this geobody and in protecting it from these sorts of threats. And it's this last issue of monarchy that I just want to jump back to. And I just want to go back to where I started, to the town of Prayer. This is the last traditional chief of Prayer, Jao Piriya Tepawong. Now when the Shan rebelled and invaded Prayer, he sort of did nothing for a few days, and then he thought, I think I'll get the hell out of here, and he went to Luang Prabang in French Indochina, where he lived under French protection in a minor official capacity for the rest of his life. When the Siamese arrived, I'll just about get there, Nick. When the Siamese arrived, they accused Jao Tepawong of supporting the Shan rebels, of inciting the rebellion because he was concerned about his loss of power. And they sentenced him to death in his absence, and they replaced him with a Siamese commissioner. So the end of that royal line in Prayer. So, looking at the Shan rebellion, another reason I think it's important and useful is that it can make us start to think about how Thailand came to only have one king. Now this might seem a really obvious and natural thing, but how is it that the chief, the traditional chief of one township in Siam, came to dominate monarchy in the entire country? If you think that's a ridiculous question, just look south in Malaysia. It doesn't need to be like that. And by looking at incidents like the Shan Rebellion, we can see how these monarchs were overthrown. The great overthrower of monarchy in Siam is the monarchy. So we can wonder, well, why couldn't Siam have had two monarchs or even three, one of the last monarchs of Chiang Mai, or even more? So I think that's an interesting historical counterfactual to reflect on. So why was the Shan Rebellion important? It's historically interesting in its own right, but I also think it can tell us some very important things about how the modern geobody of Siam was formed and imagined. Thank you very much.